Hello, welcome to MEA'S Place. Today we are doing some devotional Bible reading in the book of Esther. We finally made it to Esther. I'm excited. In chapter 1. But first we're going to go to the MacArthur Study Bible right here. And we're going to look into some historical notes and background on Esther to see what is going on. And I'm going to start with the title, The Book of Esther. Esther serves as the title without variation through the ages. This book and the Book of Ruth are the only Old Testament books named after women. Like Song of Solomon, Obadiah, and Nahum, the New Testament does not quote or allude to Esther. Haggadah 2:7, meaning myrtle, was the Hebrew name of Esther, which came either from the Persian word star or possibly from the name of the Babylonian love goddess Ishtar. As the orphaned daughter of her father Abihail, Esther grew up in Persia with her older cousin Mordecai, who raised her as if she were his own daughter. Author and date. The author remains unknown, although Mordecai, Ezra, and Nehemiah had been suggested. Whoever penned Esther posed a detailed knowledge of Persian customs, etiquette, and history, plus particular familiarity with the palace at Shushan. He also exhibited intimate knowledge of the Hebrew calendar and customs, while additionally showing a strong sense of Jewish nationalism. Possibly a Persian Jew who later moved back to Israel, wrote Esther. Esther appears as the 17th book in the literary chronological of the Old Testament and closes the Old Testament historical section. Only Ezra 7 through 10, Nehemiah, and Malachi report later Old Testament history than Esther. The account in Esther ends in 473 BC, before Ahasuerus died by assassination. That was in 465 BC. Esther Chapter 10:2 speaks as though Ahasuerus' reign has been completed. So the earliest possible writing date would be after his reign, around mid-5th century BC. The latest reasonable date would be prior to 331 BC, when Greece conquered Persia. Background and setting. Esther occurred during the Persian period of world history, which was 539 BC. Daniel chapter 5:30 and 31 to 331 BC, which would be in Daniel chapter 8, 1 through 27. Ahasuerus ruled from 486 to 465 BC. Esther covers the 483 to 473 BC portion of his reign. The name Ahasuerus represents the Hebrew transliteration of the Persian name Xerxes, while Xerxes represents his Greek name. The events of Esther occurred during the wider time span between the first return of the Jews after the 70-year captivity in Babylon. And that's in Daniel chapter 9, 1 through 19, under Zerubbabel in 538 BC. And that's recorded in Ezra chapter 1 through 6. And the second return led by Ezra in 458 BC, which is recorded in Ezra chapter 7 through 10. Nehemiah's journey, the third return from Susa to Jerusalem, and that's recorded in Nehemiah chapter 1 through 2, occurred later in 445 BC. Esther and Exodus both chronicle how vigorously foreign powers tried to eliminate the Jewish race, and how God sovereignly preserved his people in accordance with his covenant promise to Abraham. And that's around 2100 to 2075 BC. That's recorded in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and 17, 1 through 8. As a result of God's prevailing, Esther 9:10 records the beginning of Purim, a new annual festival in the 12th month. That's in February through March. To celebrate the nation's survival, Purim became one of two festivals given outside of the Mosaic legislation to still be celebrated in Israel. Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, is the other, which is recorded in John chapter 10:22. Historical and theological themes. All 167 verses of Esther has ultimately been accepted as canonical, although the absence of God's name anywhere has caused some to unnecessarily doubt its authenticity. The Greek Septuagint LXX added an extra 107, and I'm going to mispronounce this word, I apologize, apocrypha verses which supposedly compensated for this lack. Along with Song of Solomon, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations, Esther stands with the Old Testament books of the Megillah, or Five Scrolls. Rabbis read these books in the synagogue on 5 special occasions during the year, Esther being read at Purim, and that's chapter 9, 20 through 32. Okay. See. Let me. Okay, here we go. The historical genesis for the drama played out between Mordecai, Benjamite descendant of Saul, which is recorded in chapter 2:5, and Haman, an Agagite, which is recorded in chapter 3:1, 8, 3, 5, 9, and 24. Goes back almost 1,000 years when the Jews exited from Egypt. That was in 1445 BC. And were attacked by the Amalekites, and that's recorded in Exodus 17:8 through 16, whose lineage began with Amalek, grandson of Ahasuerus, and I'm going to mispronounce this name, I apologize. Ahasuerus, that's recorded in Genesis 36:12. God pronounced his curse on the Amalekites, which resulted in their total elimination as a people. And this recorded in Exodus 17:14 and Deuteronomy 25:17 through 19. Although Saul in 1030 BC received orders to kill all the Amalekites, including their king Agag in 1 Samuel 15:2 and 3, he disobeyed in 1 Samuel 15:7 through 9, and incurred God's displeasure in 1 Samuel 15:11, 26, 28, and 18. Samuel finally hacked Agag into pieces in 1 Samuel 15:32, 33. Because of his lineage from Agag, Haman carried deep hostility towards the Jews. The time of Esther arrived 550 years after the death of Agag, but in spite of such passage of time, neither Haman the Agagite nor Mordecai the Benjamite had forgotten the tribal feud that still smoldered in their souls. This explains why Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman in chapter 3:2 and 3, and why Haman so vigorously attempted to exterminate the Jewish race in chapter 3, 5, and 6, and 13. As expected, God prophesied to extinguish the Amalekites, and in Exodus 17:14, Deuteronomy 25:17 through 19, and God's promise to preserve the Jews in Genesis 17:1 through 8 prevailed. Because of God's faithfulness to save his people, the festival of Purim, named after the Akkadian word for Lot, in chapter 3, 7, 9, and 26, an annual 2-day holiday of feasting, rejoicing, sending food to one another, and giving gifts to the poor, which is recorded in chapter 9, 21, and 22, was decreed to be celebrated in every generation by every family in every province and city. Esther later added a new feature of fasting and lamentation. Purim is not biblically mentioned again, although it has been celebrated throughout the centuries in Israel. Esther could be compared to a chess game. God and Satan, as invisible players, moved real kings, queens, and nobles. When Satan put Haman into place, it was as if he announced, check, God then positioned Esther and Mordecai in order to put Satan into checkmate. Ever since the fall of man, recorded in Genesis chapter 3, 1 through 19, Satan has attempted to spiritually sever God's relationship with his human creation and disrupt God's covenant promises with Israel. For example, Christ's line through the tribe of Judah had been murderously reduced to Rash alone, who was rescued and preserved. This is recorded in 2 Chronicles 22, 10 through 12. Later, Herod slaughtered the infants of Bethlehem, thinking Christ was among them. This is recorded in Matthew 2, 16. Satan tempted Christ to denounce God and worship him. Matthew 4, 9. Peter, at Satan's insistence, tried to block Christ's journey to Calvary. Matthew 16:22. Finally, Satan entered into Judas, who then betrayed Christ to the Jews and Romans. This was recorded in Luke chapter 22, 3 through 6. While God was not mentioned in Esther, he was everywhere apparent as the one who opposed and foiled Satan's diabolical schemes by providential intervention. In Esther, all of God's unconditional covenant promises to Abraham, which is recorded in Genesis 17, 1 through 8, and to David, which is recorded in 2 Samuel 7, 8 through 16, was jeopardized. However, God's love for Israel is nowhere more apparent than in this dramatic rescue of his people from pending elimination. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Psalms 121, 4. Interpretive challenges. Okay, let me get another angle on the interpretive challenges here. Okay, there we go. That's better. The most obvious question raised by Esther comes from the fact that God is nowhere mentioned as in Song of Solomon, nor does the writer or any participant refer to the law of God. The Levitical sacrifices, worship, or prayer. The skeptic might ask, why would God never be mentioned when the Persian king receives over 175 references? Since God sovereignly prevailed to save the Jews, why does he then not receive appropriate recognition? It seems satisfying to respond that if God desired to be mentioned, he could just as sovereignly have moved the author to write of him as he acted to save Israel. This situation seems to be more of a problem at the human level than the divine, because Esther is the classic illustration of God's providence, as he, the unseen power, controls everything for his purpose. There are no miracles in Esther, but the preservation of Israel through providential control of every event and person reveals the omniscience and omnipotence of Jehovah. Whether he is named is not the issue. He is clearly the main character in the drama. Second, why were Mordecai and Esther so secular in their lifestyles? Esther 2, 6 through 20 does not seem to have the zeal for holiness like Daniel in Daniel 1, 8 through 20. Mordecai kept his and Esther's Jewish heritage secret, unlike Daniel in Daniel 6:5. The law of God was absent in contrast to Ezra in Ezra 7:10. Nehemiah had a heart for Jerusalem that seemingly eluded the affections of Esther and Mordecai in Nehemiah 1 through 2:5. The following observations help to shed some light on these issues. First, this short book does not record everything. Perhaps Mordecai and Esther actually possessed a deeper faith than becomes apparent here in 4:16. Second, even godly Nehemiah did not mention his God when talking to King Artaxerxes in Nehemiah 2:1 through 8. Third, the Jewish festivals which provided structure for worship had been lost long before Esther. Passover in 2 Kings 23:22 and tabernacles in Nehemiah 8:17. Fourth, possibly the anti-Jewish letter written by the Samaritans to Ahasuerus several years earlier had frightened them in 486 BC. This is recorded in Ezra 4:6. Fifth, the evil intentions of Haman did not just first surface when Mordecai refused to bow down, which is recorded in chapter 3:1 and 2. Most likely they were long before shared by others, which would have intimidated the Jewish population. Sixth, Esther did identify with her Jewish heritage at a most appropriate time, and this was recorded in chapter 7:3 and 4. And yet the nagging question of why Esther and Mordecai did not seem to have the same kind of open devotion to God as did Daniel remains. Further, Nehemiah's prayer in Nehemiah 1:5 through 11, especially verse 7, seems to indicate a spiritual lethargy among the Jewish exiles in Susa. So this issue must ultimately be resolved by God, since He alone knows human hearts. And it gives an outline of Esther. Okay. Now we have the historical facts behind Esther. Now let's go to chapter 1 and start reading. Whew. King Ahasuerus' royal feast. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who was present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There was white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple and silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a Masonic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance from the other, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. Let's see. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Habarna, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner towards all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus, brought to her by the eunuchs? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king, and the princes and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house, and speak in the language of his own people. Okay. Now let's go to the study notes in chapter 1 to get some in depth about chapter 1 verses. And let's see. And it also gives the historical chronological for Esther. Okay, let's go down to the study notes in the MacArthur Study Bible right here. Let me get y'all at an angle. There we are. Okay, in chapter 1 study notes right here of the MacArthur Study Bible, I'm going to start with 1:1 of the study notes here. Ahasuerus' background in setting 127 provinces. The kingdom comprised 20 regions, which were further divided into provinces ruled over by governors. India to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, not Asia Minor, is mentioned as representing the western edge of the kingdom to avoid any remembrance of the king's previous defeat by the Greeks, which was in 481 to 479 BC. This description also avoided any confusion with the Ahasuerus of Daniel, which is in 9:1. Okay, Susan the citadel. Susan, the Hebrew rendering of the Greek Susa. The winter residence was one of 4 capital cities. The other 3 included Babylon, Ecbatana, which is recorded in Ezra 6:2, the Persepolis. I'm probably mispronouncing that location. I apologize. The citadel refers to the fortified palace complex built above the city for protection. The 3rd year, 843 BC, this probably included the planning phase for Ahasuerus' later campaign against Greece, in which the king suffered a humiliating defeat, which was recorded in years 481 to 479 BC. Persia and Media. Cyrus the Persian inherited Media, and thus the name Media became just as prominent as Persia, which is 550 BC. Okay, let's see. Queen Vashti. Greek literature records her name as Amystress. She gave birth in 483 BC to Ahasuerus' 3rd son, Artaxerxes, who later succeeded his father Ahasuerus on the throne. This was recorded in Ezra Chapter 7:1. Vashti refused. Her reason is not recorded, although suggested have included that 1, her appearance would have involved lewd behavior before drunken men, or 2, that she was still pregnant with Artaxerxes. The 7 princes, these highest-ranking officials, and which is recorded in Ezra 7:14, were perhaps equivalent to the Magi of Daniel 1:20. Okay. Will not be altered the irrevocable nature of Persian law, which is recorded in Daniel 6:8, 12, 15, played an important role in how the rest of Esther concluded. Letters. The efficient Persian communication network, a rapid relay by horses, played an important role in speedily publishing kingdom edicts. Okay. And it even gives you the Persian Empire in 500 BC and the map of the Persian Empire and Arabia of what it's talking about here. Okay. I hope this has encouraged you and has been very thoughtful and engaging. If you do like this video, please give a thumbs up and subscribe. And also, I will leave a link down in the description below on the MacArthur Study Bible, because it is a great source to have when you read your Bible and more understanding and historical events and everything to better understand the Bible. And of course, I will be leaving a link down in the description below on some shirts and keychains and Bible verse bracelets. And because we all can't go around naked, so you might as well look down in that description below and check out some holy shirts. And if you got holes in your shirts because you've been wearing it for years, you might as well check down in that description below on some new holy shirts. Until next time, God bless you in everything that you do.